Добар ден, другарки и другари. Денеска на 2 декември на денот на пленумот на Левица, тука во просториите на Левица имаме посебни гости, нашите пријатели од Ирска, европарламентарците, светски познатите европарламентарци, едни од најголемите левичари во денешницата, Member of European Parliament Clare Daly and Member of European Parliament Mick Wallace. It is our great honor to have you here as friends of our party, as friends of Macedonia. And it's nice to have you in Macedonia. You said this is your first time here. Here you have immense popularity. I'd say with Angel Jambaski, you're the most famous MEPs, but for completely different reasons.
We won't tell him.
For completely different reasons. And with you, this follows a trend, not only in Macedonia, but you have seen massive popularity across the world in countries outside of the EU, countries wanting to join the EU. But your popularity comes from you being outspoken about the problems that have infested the European Union and its institutions. But for us here, the picture that we are presented with is usually that of the European Union being this being this organization that brings upon opportunity of its member countries, and that it's milk and honey, we said. So for us that are outside of the scope of the European Union, is this so? Like, is this really the organization of opportunity and milk and honey, and how harmonious are European institutions?
Do you want to go first on that?
Well, I think it is milk and honey for the big corporations, for the military-industrial complex, for big agri, for all of the lobbyists who dictate policy on European matters. It's a very good deal for them. But for the citizens of the EU, life is pretty bleak at the moment, to be perfectly honest. Most of the economies are going into recession through the ridiculous tactics of sanctions, supposedly to punish Russia. The idiots at the helm of the European Union have succeeded in the Russian economy bypassing the German one and being the strongest economy in Europe now. And we see huge inflation, massive problems with the cost of living, with energy crisis. There's a housing crisis in practically every single member state of a catastrophic proportion. And that's without mentioning the fact that they have aided and abetted and ensured that NATO's proxy war against Russia has continued at an enormous cost to the people of Ukraine, but also to the citizens of Europe. So it is lunacy and far from milk and honey, I think.
Is it, Mick? Is it milk and honey?
Well, I suppose every state has its challenges, and I'd say, no matter where you lived, you would see reasons to be dissatisfied with how things are organised. As a rule, society is not organised in a fair manner in most parts of the world. In fact, we would always say that we'd never seen a government that we liked anywhere. So, obviously, the European Union is different from a normal state, but it takes on much of the same powers as a state, only on a bigger level. And how they do it, as Claire has pointed out, leaves a lot to be desired for us, because we can see that it's structured to look after the elites. Ever since probably around 1985, they kind of, when the Single European Act came in, they've kind of enshrined neoliberalism in the treaties now. And that began in 85. It was the time of Thatcher in Britain. You had Reagan in America at the time. And it was kind of like, neoliberalism is really capitalism with the gloves off. And that became even stronger with the treaties of Lisbon and the treaties of Nice. And both of them were seriously problematic for the citizens in Ireland. And we voted against both of them. But it was the wrong answer, and we had to vote again. And they try to bribe us with sweets to change our mind, to come up with a different answer. So we were intimidated into coming up with a different answer, and we eventually agreed to the treaties. Now, not every country has a vote when there's a treaty change, but it's part of our constitution. And it was part of our agreement when we joined in 1973 that if there was a change to the constitution, that the Irish government had to put it to the people. So it's pretty democratic. It's a good system that we have that. But today, following Lisbon and Nice in particular, we see the European Union as blatantly serving the interests of elites rather than serving the interests of the ordinary citizen. And as Clare pointed out, when, for example, the Russians invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, we condemned the invasion because it was illegal and it was a breach of the UN Charter. But the European Union took it as an opportunity to punish Russia as much as they could, because it's what the Americans wanted to happen. And as Clare said, the sanctions that we introduced against Russia have been self-defeating. We've seen a 17% increase in food prices. Some countries have seen an increase of 50% in energy costs. All for what? Absolute madness. So we were prepared to punish our own people in our effort to punish Russia. And it just didn't make any sense. And it's just a very good example of the fact that we're more interested in serving the interests of the military-industrial complex, who are making a fortune from the war. We refused to look for peace. We wanted the war to keep going. We have already allocated over 120 billion euros towards the war project in Ukraine, and we're going to allocate another 20 billion in the next 6 weeks, 2 months, for military aid over the next 4 years for Ukraine, and that'll bring it to over 140 billion. So we're spending the money belonging to the European taxpayer just to punish Russia, to feed the military-industrial complex at great cost to our own citizens. And this is not how we think an institution like the European Union should behave.
Of course, but you said that the European Union is serving the interests of the elites. When you say elites, I would assume European elites as well, but we've seen that European elites have not been able to protect their own interests within the scope of the 2-year crisis the European Union has been facing following Ukraine. So why aren't German industrialists protecting their own interests? How are these economies going into recession when these sanctions are hurting the European markets as well? Has the EU just become agent of serving NATO interests?
It certainly looks that way, and we ask ourselves that question all of the time. Like when the invasion of Ukraine happened and the first level of sanctions happened, and then the second and the third, up to the 12th round of sanctions occurred. At every stage we said, now there's going to be a stage where European capitalism, German capitalism in particular, is going to intervene to protect its own interests. And we couldn't really figure out why that didn't happen. But it does seem to be that, they were coward. Some of them felt afraid of speaking out because such was the orchestrated level of sort of response to the invasion in Ukraine that people were silenced. Everyone was a Putin puppet. If you spoke up and you were a German industrialist and you said, no, I'm not going to sanction it, this is not in my business interest, they'd say, oh, you're just doing that, you're a Putin puppet, you're a Russian agent. It was an absolutely magnificent campaign, if you like, of silencing opposition. So yes, the those at the helm, and it's a point that Mick made earlier, what is the European Union? You see, sometimes people look at someone like Ursula von der Leyen and say she is the European Union. She isn't. She's She's not even elected. She's a bureaucratic head and a civil servant appointed. But she and some people around her, these bureaucracy based in Brussels, and it involves tens of thousands of people linked into that bubble. And they are trying on a bit of a power grab to represent themselves as the European Union, separate from the 27 member states, which is what it's supposed to be. So there is a struggle going on there between that. And under von der Leyen, it has definitely shifted to that sort of power grab from the centre. It's a very Atlanticist view. So she's completely subservient to the interests of US empire, whether they're getting paid by that. I don't know. We've always said, much as we would not like her politics, we don't think this would have happened if Merkel was still in power in Germany, because Merkel had the German capitalist interests at heart first, and that was benefited by being in the EU and a strong EU. The leadership in Germany is incredibly weak now at a national level. A lot of the commissioners are very, very weak, and you have these bureaucrats in the background manipulating things. That is going to come at an incredibly heavy price for the EU, because the divisions between the member states and that are emerging more and more also. But yeah, I mean, it's you're right. It's amazing. And I mean, we haven't touched on China, but whatever about, you know, cutting your own throat in terms of the war with Russia, given the level of economic interaction there, it was important. And let's be honest, a lot of them work around it as well. So it's not that they're totally fleecing themselves. But if that was to be carried on with China, the way in which von der Leyen, well, European capitalism would be finished. And we can only assume that they're not that mad. Or are they?
Yeah, well, in particular, since 2019, when von der Leyen became president of the Commission, we have seen a greater level of subservience to the US. And when they set about cutting off imports of energy from Russia, they literally turned around and decided that they would buy LNG from America, from Israel, from Qatar, right? So, and we started buying LNG from America. There's a huge environmental cost for bringing it 5,000 kilometers across the sea, across the ocean. The Europeans' industry were paying and are 4 times more for LNG than the equivalent industry in America is paying. So, for example, if you have an industry in Germany trying to make a particular type of car, you have the same industry in America making the same car and paying only 25% as much for the price of the LNG. Now, come on. I mean, this is not how we understood how capitalism worked, right? Exactly. This is madness. And it is so self-defeating for European industry. But yet, they've been driven there by the likes now of von der Leyen has been a huge element in this. Now, she's not on her own, right? But this is really powerful for the Americans. We have become a pawn for them. Now, listen, you could argue that we've been a bit of a pawn to the Americans for a long time, since the Second World War. And when NATO was formed in 1949, it was formed by the Americans to keep the Europeans in control, so that the Europeans were never going to go to war with somebody else without America's blessing, right? No, okay, they pretend that it's a security apparatus to protect Europe, but that is not how NATO has worked, obviously, right? So, but we have been subservient to the Americans a lot since the end of the Second World War, but that has increased dramatically in the last few years, and that is really worrying. And as Claire mentioned, China, the Americans now have a big problem with China. China is obviously not a threat to the security of the people of America. There's no Chinese warships off the coast of America. Mm-hmm. There's loads of American warships in the South China Sea, right? So there's loads of military bases in the Philippines and all around that ring, around the South China Sea, focused on China. the Chinese don't have military bases focused on America. In actual fact, the only military base that the Chinese have outside of their own region is in Djibouti, in Africa.
Djibouti, yeah.
Right?
Where a lot of countries actually have.
Yes, the Americans and the Russians have one as well, right? But the Americans now are trying to drive a wedge between the EU and China, because I said China is not a threat to America's security, but China is a threat to the supremacy of the dollar. And the supremacy of the dollar is absolutely paramount to the Americans. The Americans can only do what they do because of their control of the world financial system. Ever since Bretton Woods in 1944, the dollar became king. It's the world currency. It was originally tagged to gold, broken by Nixon in 1971. So now the Americans were allowed to print what they like. And it's been a massive power tool for the Americans. The Americans have sanctions against 39 countries at the moment in the world, all of them illegal. They all breached the UN Charter, right? 39 countries. They couldn't do it without the supremacy of the dollar. So the Chinese now is the fastest growing economy in the world. It's got 33% of world GDP, phenomenal amount of the percentage of GDP worldwide. This is a huge problem for the Americans. The Chinese are starting to trade in currencies that is not dollar. The Russians now are starting it. The Indians have done a bit of it. And this will spread. Right? This is a big problem for the Americans. So what the Americans then are doing is they're trying to stifle the progress of China, and they're trying to divide the EU and China with a view to slowing the progress of China. But it's not going to work. China is too well organized. It's too powerful. Whether people like it or not, but China is the future. And the EU and the Americans, they're set to build a wall around China and around Russia, and with a view to isolating them. But when the Europeans and Americans introduced their sanctions against Russia over the Ukraine invasion, they struggled to get the world's support. And the countries that contain 80% of the world's population have refused to take sides in the war. They're not taking sides with Russia. They're not taking sides with the EU and NATO and Americans. They said they were staying neutral and they wanted peace. 80% of the world want peace. So what you had, instead of the Western Bloc of the US, EU, instead of them succeeding in building a wall around China, they're actually building a wall around themselves. It's the old colonialists. They are the past. China and those that work with China will be the future.
When you said that America, of course, has had control over European affairs for much of the time after World War II, however, you mentioned, of course, that in the time of Merkel being at the helm of Germany, there was a balance between German and Russian interests and then American interests. So right now, as we see how Europe is losing its locus of control completely, is it that it's only an absence of strong leadership? Is it the financial domination of the US over the European Union? Is it the military incapabilities of the European militaries? And is there a future where the European Union can impose itself as one of the poles within the multipolar world?
Well, that is the question, isn't it? And I think the answer is probably a combination of all of the factors that you mentioned. I mean, the future of Europe in some ways is up for grabs at the moment. They're very much playing the game of being the puppet of US imperialism, but also at the same time trying to hoover up every other European country other than Russia to be in our gang. Now, who would want to be in a gang that's so subservient to a bigger sort of a power somewhere else? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. And if they think by doing that, it's going to make the European Union stronger, it isn't. I mean, it's already come out into the open that the idea of the likes of Ukraine joining the EU would fundamentally alter it completely. It could not continue in the way in which it has been engaged from the start. So how did we get to this place and how do we get out of it? I mean, in some ways, it is a crisis of European capitalism. There's no doubt about that. It's a crisis of global capitalism because the instability that we see in the world is coming out of the dying days of US domination. That's why we are where we are. And actually, the EU going behind them is a big mistake. Can they rescue themselves and get that air? We would like to think so, because we've been fortunate enough in our position to be able to travel quite a lot. And it doesn't matter where we go in the world, people always say, it's terrible to see Europe doing this to itself, because Europe used to be different. They go on about values and democracy and bringing all those things. They didn't just rape and pillage when they went to these countries, but now that's all gone. And that's really sad. We've been in many countries where they've said that they regret that. They want to have good relations with an independent Europe. They felt that Europe could put manners or make the US maybe be a little bit more attentive to international law, but they've given that up now. But look, that can change. Let's see what happens if Trump comes back. Are they going to be playing that game? It's got worse with Biden in power. Mm-hmm. And the Democrats have been just as bad as Trump. They've taken all the worst things that Trump did, kept them, and made them even worse. And the Democrats being in power has actually made the European Union worse, because they bend the knee in a way in which they didn't when Trump was there, so.
I think for anyone, for independent people looking in at what's going on in the European Union, and people that have followed the politics over the last 30 years, it's pretty obvious that there's a change, there's a different mood from the leaders in Europe. And like Ireland joined in 1973, we joined an economic union. Right? Listen to the language today. Listen to what they'll be saying to an accession state or a candidate state trying to get into the European Union to talk about security policy. There was no talk about security policy 30 years ago.
Talks about identity.
Yeah, like now. And so Europe has changed its emphasis. Now, not only has it become more of a pawn to the US than it ever was before, but it's also starting to look in a more of an expansionist way. They're determined to get into Africa more. We train soldiers down in Africa. We've had troops in the Sahel region since 2013. There's over 20,000 European troops in the Sahel doing nothing good. Only their own main emphasis is to try and hold the European influence, maintain their ability to access mineral wealth at a cheap price, to compete with the Chinese in Africa. We've become more expansionist in our thinking. We formed the European Union so that we would work together. It didn't have to be expansionist. We didn't have to be a bigger entity and have imperial ambition. But now there's an element of that there. There's sort of an imperial ambition developing, and there's so much. We're on the Security and Defence Committee and Foreign Affairs, and we hear so much talk about the militarisation of Europe, spending more money on this section, spending more money on that. We are pumping more and more and more money into the military end of it, when in actual fact, the whole idea of a healthy European Union would be about serving the interest of its people, dealing with the housing crises that are all over Europe, improving public transport, tackling the challenges of climate change, improving, making health affordable for everybody. This is what we understood the European Union to be, and but we're losing our way, and sadly, the wrong people are at the helm. Now, you asked about Merkel, right? And no doubt about it, right? But when Merkel was in power, we used to always say, listen, the Germans run the European Union, and they run it in Germans' interests first, and then everybody else. But it was actually working better than it is now. Now, we didn't like it then either, because it was too neoliberal orientated. Big business was calling the shots. They were making the decisions. And I can understand you wondering today, how in God's name have German industry allowed a German von der Leyen to actually undermine their own industry to the benefit of the Americans? This is madness. I mean, we believe in the European project in the sense that we like the idea of the European Union, European countries working together to serve the best interests of their citizenry. We believe in that, but that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing a European Union that's been run now for the elites, being too much of a pawn of the Americans, spending too much money on military defence, boosting the military-industrial complex, wanting to promote war rather than peace. They refuse to look for peace in Ukraine. They refuse to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. This is the first time that a European Union has failed to call for a ceasefire when Israel was bombarding Gaza. This time they're not even calling for a ceasefire. They went there and they said that Israel had their backing, they had their unconditional support no matter what. So we've given our blessing to an Israeli genocide against the people of Palestine now. We have fueled the war in Ukraine for almost 2 years at incredible cost to the working class soldiers of Ukraine. They reckon over 200,000 working class Ukrainians have died in the war as troops. Absolute mad. For what? This war is 100% stupid. And we, the European Union, that used to call itself a peace project, we have done zero to establish peace. It's shocking.
Well, it's evident the subservience of the European Union to the American interests is ever growing, but for us who feel that we're subservient to the European interest here in Macedonia, for us, for the past 2 decades, Macedonia has been one of the most devoted candidates to the accession of the European Union. We have had many compromises on the path towards the European Union. When the name change happened, one of the components in the referendum question was actually, firstly, do you want to join the EU and then NATO with the constitutional change? But now more and more criteria is being imposed that's completely outside of the Copenhagen criteria. So what would a country like Macedonia gain with joining the European Union? What would happen? What do you think is the next step for the European Union with having expanded its member states, and what would that look like for Macedonia within this geopolitical constellation?
Well, look, I suppose what it would look like, the short answer is what it looked like for all of the other former Soviet states or so on, the likes of Bulgaria, which saw an 11% drop in its population and its people going to Western Europe to operate as a pool of cheap labour, while those in authority sort of use some European funds to line their own back pockets and live the high life. And for ordinary people, life has not changed. If anything, it has got worse, with the only plus being the ability to go and work somewhere else. Is that a future that people want? Because that's really what the EU has offered people in the past. And yeah, it's not a very attractive proposition. What they've demanded of you has been actually humiliating, if you think about it. Change the name of your country, join NATO. As Mick said, when we joined the European Union, we insisted that our neutrality would be respected. Now, also with us as a small country, we were the first neutral country to join, and we were given assurances at every turn that our neutrality would be protected. But of course, that's chipped away. And now we have the European Union and NATO being synonymous with each other. Our government tell us, oh, no, we're not going to join NATO, but we'll just do more military work with our EU partners, our like-minded partners. But what is that? What is a like-minded partner? I haven't of the same viewpoint as the Prime Minister in my country. We're both Irish, but we view things very differently because I don't represent the interests of the corporate elites and big business. He does. That's the same in every country. And actually, the divide in Europe And the future of Europe has to be between the haves and the haves not. It doesn't matter what country you come from. I mean, we would like to see an alliance. It makes us, we're pro-European in the sense that we're internationalists. And pro-European includes Russia, because the last time I learned, a big chunk of Russia was in Europe. So we can't rewrite geography in the way in which they're trying to rewrite history. All of these things are going on, but it should be an alliance of the people of Europe deciding its future against the corporate interests that are dominating and taking a hold. Because what we have now in Europe is corporate capture, a bit like the US, whereby the big business elects the president, they answer to that tune. That's beginning to kind of happen in Europe a bit, where the big lobbyists take over. So for us, if Macedonia wants to join the EU, bring it on. You're more than welcome as far as we're concerned, but I don't think it's an answer to your problems, because the problems that working people face in the EU are, from the sounds of talking to you, are pretty much the same as the ones you have now. So the solution to that will not really be joining the EU. It will be how all of us together work at trying to find an alternative where we take on the vested interests that run our economies. And in doing that, I think linking up with all the people around the world, because Mick is right, like you see the EU intervening now in other countries, but they say, oh, but we bring democracy and values. That's what we do. The other people are just exploiting their own interests. Well, they're all exploiting their own interests. That's what they all do. But the good thing is, and the hope that we get, is that you look at the countries of Africa with their young populations who are running the Europeans out and saying no more colonialism. The countries in South America who've elected radical governments who've saying, no, we're not going to be sanctioned, we're not going to be quiet. And they've stood and they've survived. It's embodied in the resistance in Palestine that we see. What else can Israel do? You know, they've turned a corner, they've seen their worst, and they will not win in this. They will not win out of this. It may come at a huge cost, but they won't. So that's deviated from what does the European Union bring Macedonia. But there is no magic wand. That's what it'll bring you.
No, because right now in Europe there is a certain polarization, and the Western media are trying to impose a narrative that there are democratic countries, so-called democratic countries, and then so-called authoritarian countries. And if we do not join the EU, we are destined to become this authoritarian hellhole, is what the narrative is, and that our security will be jeopardized, that our economy will be jeopardized, that our finances will be ever dwindling. So is really not entering the European Union, would that mean doom for a country? In your own view?
Yeah. No, go on.
Well, I think it's very important that it's not really, it's not for us to tell the Macedonians, oh, you should join or you shouldn't join. It's something that you've got to make up your own mind on, and the people of Macedonia should be able to make that call. We were in Georgia a few months ago, and we had a very interesting time there. And it was actually, I see many similarities, right? And what we see in Georgia, and I believe some of it is going on in Macedonia, we have American and European money investing in NGOs, in media, in civil society groups, and trying to develop a new narrative, trying to drive a wedge, trying to make them less attached to Russia and more part of the NATO camp, more part of the US camp. And well, we actually don't see that as being positive, right? We think that, for example, in Georgia, it's absolutely paramount for Georgia to have a good relationship with all its neighbours. And it has its biggest border with Russia. So the idea of Georgia not having a good relationship with Russia would be suicide on part of Georgia. But Georgia wants a good relationship with the European Union, and I think the majority of the people of Georgia want to join the European Union for good reasons or bad, whatever, right? And we think that the likes of Georgia and Macedonia should be allowed to have a good relationship with all its neighbours, be able to have a good relationship with Europe, with America, with Russia, with China. Right? It's the way forward, right? And it's peace. But you're talking about, the European says, but we're the democracy and we're the liberals and we're the ones with the values. Listen, we don't have values, we have interests, right? And they are on full show at the moment. We refuse to work for peace in Ukraine. We spend billions making sure the war doesn't stop. Where's the values there? What values are we talking about there? We're supporting a genocide in Gaza. A genocide. What values are on display with our unconditional support for a far-right apartheid Israeli regime? What values are they, for example? Tell me, as I'd like to know. Listen, remember, we have interest, not values. And as we're a bit like Groucho Marx, the famous American comedian, said a long time ago, I have my principles, and if you don't like them, I've more. Right? I mean, we have a big problem. We talk about human rights. We talk about international law. We talk about humanitarian law. But we ignore them when it suits our interest. We apply them, we weaponize them when it suits us. And then we're silent when it suits us. That's not having values, that's having interest.
Yeah, I just want to add two things to that, because one, in the battle, if you like, between democracy and authoritarian regimes, the European Union is becoming increasingly authoritarian, and people should realise that. I mean, we have, well, for example, now we have protests being banned if they are pro-Palestine, allegedly. We've countries in Europe, we did a debate last week on Spain. People have been injured by rubber bullets in Spain. There's huge issues around the independence of the judiciary. There are people in jail because of the lyrics of their songs. In countries like Spain, which would be seen to be moderate countries, there's massive violations of fundamental rights in major parts of the European Union, whereby, if you like, a different opinion is called disinformation. People are being cancelled because they have a different view. People are not allowed to have protests. There are curtailments on loads of civil liberties. So freedom of expression is being silenced under hate speech laws. Now, we obviously, fully believe that there shouldn't be hate speech, but this has been taken to manipulate and silence dissenting views. And we're seeing this a lot, that in the name of freedom, there are greater police powers, greater violence from the police, all of these. And this is in Europe. So there's a total of what they say one thing and what's happening on the ground is the other. And you say, would your security be jeopardised? What has jeopardised the security of Europe is increased militarisation. Now, they're trying to say, we need to spend more money on militarism because Russia is the big baddie and he's coming to get us and we weren't spending enough money. History does not vindicate that viewpoint. The opposite is the case. As Mick said, when the European Union wasn't spending all that money on militarism, when it wasn't engaging in that way, Europe was much, much safer. It's only since it has begun to spend all that extra money on militarism, to ratchet itself up as a sort of a defence union and to be more in that direction, that it has become more unsafe. Because if you're spending all that money on militarism, you have to use it. So we would argue that actually that's what's made Europe unsafe. And unfortunately, probably in Macedonia, certainly in our country, our leadership are a bit subservient to the European elites. They're embarrassed of our history. They say that we are an embarrassment and a disgrace because we have the confidence in our viewpoint and our history as a country that was occupied to say, no, we come from a revolutionary tradition and we affiliate with oppressed people everywhere. We're not going to bend the knee and support Israel against Palestine. And we find this. Mick is right to talk about Georgia. And you're a small country like we are, but it's very clear even in the short term that you have an enormous history, a culture, a tradition. And the European Union wants to blot that out in all of our countries. In Latvia and Lithuania, they're taking down statues. They're rewriting the history of what happened in World War II. This is incredibly dangerous. And all of our countries together, we all have different histories, but they're all so diverse. And so why would we be a threat to anybody? We mutually complement each other and we have a great future together. It's the people in power who are ruining that for themselves, as they're doing, to be honest, in South America and in Africa and everywhere else as well. So, I mean, it's, Yeah,
and I mean, one of the reasons, for example, that you hear regularly from some of our leaders in the European Union, one of the reasons that they give for, we must increase our security there, we must spend more on defence there. They say now that China is also a security threat to the European Union. Now, that's not true. That's a lie.
It's not.
It's not true. China is a long piece from Europe, a long way from China. We're a long way from China. China is not going to invade the European mainland. Now, people might find it interesting that the Chinese have not dropped a bomb on anybody in the whole world in 40 years. Nobody. Zero. The Americans have dropped bombs on somebody every day in the last 40 years. The Americans have dropped more bombs since World War II, 1945, ended, than the rest of the world put together. Who's the aggressor? And we, in the European Union, are wanting to pretend that the threat to peace and security in the world is coming from the Chinese? That's a lie.
The threat to peace and security is coming from all this money being spent on militarism, when the real needs that bring real peace and security, which is a roof over your head, a decent job, enough food, the ability to heat your house, tackling climate change. These are the things that we need to be doing to bring security. And as long as those in power in Europe now are going in the opposite direction, we'll never have that, because they're not complementary, they're contradictory.
So for the people of Macedonia, whether you are in the European Union or whether you're not in the European Union, you want the interest of your citizens served as a priority, not the interest of big business. You don't want a neoliberal stamp on how your society is organised. You want your society to be organised in a fair manner that serves the interests of your citizens, whether it's the European Union at the helm or whether it's your own independent government at the helm.
So you mentioned that authoritarianism is ever more present in the European Union, and dissidence, the so-called dissidence, is being stamped upon people. And you too have had this epitome used for you as dissidents to the European interest, to your European cause. And how has the media played its role in creating this image? Is internationalism simply not possible anymore within this framework of the military complex, of the media, and all the political actors? Have you felt isolated within the European Parliament since this campaign has started against you? And is internationalism possible at all?
Well, I think it's the opposite. And I think what we see is a difference between reality as it is presented by the mainstream media and the reality as it is in the hearts and minds of ordinary people. Because we were, as I said, demonised in Ireland day in, day out. We were Putin puppets. We love authoritarian regimes, seemingly. That's all we do, is just be fans of authoritarian regimes. And we sort of went to Europe and went mad. And the image is very much, every newspaper you'd read, you would think that we were in the European Union in a corner, and everybody, if they'd see us, would run the opposite way to say, oh my God, there's those two lunatics from Ireland, I better not be. The complete and absolute opposite is the reality. So every single day from the beginning, and yes, we got some vile communications from people when the war in Ukraine started. Jingoism always comes with the early days of war. It's completely different now, 2 years on, with everything we said being correct, which was the only way to end the war is peace, not arming and sanctioning. So that has changed. But loads of people from Ireland, from the very beginning, people from all over Europe, and I mean all over Europe. We've travelled a lot internationally, and all over internationally as well, that voice has been heard. We think it's particularly the case now in Palestine also, that I suppose the platform that we have in the European Parliament and the development of social media has allowed us to get past the mainstream media to deliver a message to that audience that's out there, and the response to that has been utterly phenomenal. So we genuinely felt that in the midst of all this abuse, which we never experienced when we were in the Irish Parliament, well, we did, but the people loved us. They weren't bought in by it because they could see us. But when the war happened, we felt we were in the right place, because we were able to give vent to the views that I firmly believe are the views of the majority of people, no matter where they come from. It's been astounding, actually, really astounding. So it's that different reality. So all of the people say, you say what I'm thinking. I'm at home and I think I'm going mad because the media and everybody is telling me what I'm thinking is wrong. But actually what people are thinking is right. That's the same the world over. And people should take great solace from that. And they only give out about you if you're doing something right. So we must be doing something right. Yeah.
Yeah, people should remember as well, you should always ask yourself, okay, the mainstream media says this, the mainstream media says that, but who owns it? Who pays their bills? Exactly. Right? It's a bit like, I always say, if an NGO came near my office in the Parliament, my first question is, who pays you? I want to know where you get your money, because you're working for the guy who pays you, right? And the same with the media. And I don't know of any I don't know many socialist organisations, for example, with serious control over large media outlets. Media tends to be owned by elites, people with a vested interest with the status quo, with the system staying the way it is, not changing. They don't necessarily have any great interest in tackling the huge growth and inequality across Europe, which we've seen because of the neoliberal approach of so many governments. We don't see the media challenging that. So we have to ask, who are the media? And sadly, we're very conscious that there's been huge investment in a lot of European media as well by the US. The US see it as a very good investment on their part to actually have the influence that they want across Europe, this investment in mainstream media. So that's really important to them. But at the same time, the war was only 4 months old, and the European Council for Foreign Relations, which is a research body as part of the European Union, they carried out a very extensive research across Europe. And one of the main questions was, would you rather peace, or would you think we should continue to punish Russia? The war was only 4 months old. It was June 2022. Over 70% of the people said they wanted peace rather than punishing Russia. And within 2 months, that figure was at 80%. Yet, Claire and myself put in an amendment to the Ukraine resolution at the plenary in September and the plenary in December, and our amendment called on the European Union to maximise its potential to bring about dialogue and diplomacy with a view to ending the war and establishing peace. Do you know that 80% of the politicians voted against that? So in other words, they didn't want the war to stop. They didn't want peace to break out. They wanted war, not peace. 80% of the politicians wanted war, and 80% of the people wanted peace. It is very striking that the political class in Europe today do not represent the people of Europe well. That is the truth.
When it comes to media coverage and the peace process within Europe, today is the 2nd of December, yesterday the summit of Ministers of Foreign Affairs, the OSCE, ended in Skopje here. And this year, Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, was here actually, because last year he was forbidden from coming to the OSCE meeting. And in response to him coming to Skopje, the Ministers of Foreign Affairs of the Baltic countries and the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine did not come. The media presented this as a victory for Russia. But isn't the OSCE and its idea with encompassing all European countries and building security ties throughout European countries. So is this really a victory for Russia with them just being present at the OSCE meeting? And do you see the tensions deflating in the future and the peace process between ministers of foreign affairs within meetings such as the OSCE could continue?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously not a victory for Russia. It is as it should be. Russia needs to participate in these organisations. We need to be internationally sitting down with them to resolve matters. The war will come to an end. We've said this from the very beginning. Relations will re-normalise, if you like. When that is, we don't know. Sadly, it could have been 2 months after the war started, when Russia and Ukraine had agreed a peace agreement for how, in return for Ukrainian neutrality, Russia would withdraw to the pre-February boundaries, and a process for working out the future of the Donbass and so on would take place over years. The deal that's going to be on the table now, I'd imagine, will be less favourable than that one from Ukraine's point of view, despite all of their so-called friends in Europe who cheerled them on, who told them to keep fighting, that they were going to win, and the only winners were the arms companies where they were selling their arms. We found it absolutely disgusting that people would say that Ukraine had to fight on reclaim all of its territory, including Crimea, where demonstrably most people in Crimea want to be with Russia. They don't want to be with Ukraine. And yet the European Union told them they had to fight on forever to reclaim that. These were the same people who said that the Irish peace agreement was one of the greatest achievements for diplomacy and for peace. And yet 17% of the island of Ireland is still under British domination. But yet that was great. We could all sign off on that, but Ukraine have to keep fighting on. It's lunacy. But your question was, will they all come round the table? Will relations be restored? Eventually they will. Probably sooner rather than later in some ways, because the Americans now, it's very obvious that Ukraine is losing and losing badly, and how long it can keep losing in these great victories is just... How long can that continue, particularly now with the genocide in Israel and so on? The US is sending more arms there. But normal relations will, of course, resume. They always do.
Yeah, I mean, you ask, was it a victory for Russia to be at the meeting when others weren't? No, we would see it as a victory when everybody's there. We want all the countries to work together. We want common sense to prevail. Rather than this mad escalation of the militarization of Europe, moving away from serving the interests of the citizens. All our governments across Europe, the 27 member states in the European Union, are very different, but they can work together. The other countries in Europe, whether you're in the European Union or not, we can work together as well. All the countries should be working together. It's in our interest. Peace makes sense and war doesn't. War serves the interest of a small group of elites. Peace serves the interest of everybody.
Lastly, with it being a current event, we've seen that the whole continent of Europe, not only the European Union, has seen never seen before support of the Palestinian cause amongst the people. However, governments have never been more pro-Israel. Including our own government. What do you think is the reason that such popular support for the Palestinian cause has risen in the latest development of events?
I suppose, sadly, it's the scale of the atrocities that Israel has unleashed. I mean, there have been other genocides, there's been other ethnic cleansing, but nothing like this. Nothing so openly declared, so brazenly implemented in full public view. It is the slaughter of innocents, be they men, women or children. They're all civilians and everyone can see it. And the lies of the Israelis, which have gone on for decades since the Nakba, have been revealed to everybody. And those who stand with them have also been revealed as liars, as absolutely violators of international law and as monumental hypocrites. And things will never be the same again for the European Union, both in the eyes of its citizens, some of whom actually genuinely believed the hype that Europe stood for values and democracy and decency. Some people actually believed that that's what their stance in Ukraine was. A lot of people, because the media kept saying that, and then they see the complete opposite stance in terms of Israel, and they are shocked to their core. And so many people have got in touch with us saying, God Almighty, you warned us about the European Union. We didn't really believe you, but now we see it. And I think a lot of people see that. I think also a lot of countries in the world see the US and the EU now and say, sorry now, but US empire and the former colonialists who dominated the world for their own interests, you're back at it again. Would you ever go and shove off? We're not listening to you anymore. We want, international law. But it's a dangerous time because what the US and EU are doing, they're trying to bonfire international law. They're trying to rewrite it to say that might is right. Now, we know that that's their viewpoint, that they've always believed that, but never in as blatant a way before. And the challenge is down now to the rest of the international community to rescue that. They have to rescue it because otherwise then if they establish that might is right, well then nobody is safe, because there's problems with the UN and all that, but it's all we've got, and it has to be rewritten, reinvigorated. The whole non-aligned movement again has to be developed. That's the only way forward out of this, absolutely.
We've probably never seen such a stark example of the vast majority of people all across Europe are siding with the oppressed Palestinians. They can see what's happening. And yet the political class is supporting the settler colonial project. They're supporting Zionism. In 1948, the Israelis threw 800,000 Palestinians out of their homes and ran them from the land. A lot of them ended up in Gaza. Those same families now are being run out of northern Gaza to the south. This is so blatantly obvious to any sensible person. We had a war in Yemen that started in March 2015. According to the UN figures, by 2021, over 400,000 were dead, 15.8 million were hungry. But we didn't see the war. We didn't see 1 minute of it, because the Americans, the Europeans, who were supporting the Saudi UAE bombardment of Yemen, they controlled everything. They controlled access to the country, they controlled the air access, they controlled the sea access, they controlled the information, and we didn't see the war. People are seeing what's happening in Gaza on their phone. It's in their pocket. It's something really different. And they cannot believe. I don't think people realised how ugly war is, because war is always terrible. And we are anti-war. We are pro-peace, no matter where it is, no matter who's carrying it out. War is stupid, and we should oppose it morning, noon and night. But it has been powerful that millions across Europe have taken to the streets. They are horrified at what they're witnessing. They can't believe that the EU and the US can actually stand by this far-right apartheid regime called Israel and what they're doing. It has shocked the people of the world.
It's led to a huge crisis in the EU, not just between the leadership and its citizens, but between the member state countries as well, where there's absolutely vast differences. Countries like our own, and we'd be critical that they haven't done enough, but they have been on the more Palestinian side. Belgium, Spain, these absolutely not enough. We're not saying that, but there's huge divisions within. There's massive divisions amongst the staff who work in the institutions, the diplomats behind the scenes. Everybody can see this will not be the same again. And I think one of the most significant issues to come out of this, and why it's different, is that we see now huge sections of the Jewish population breaking with the Zionist project. And that's key, because Zionism was never going to be defeated militarily. That was never going to happen. But politically, the dismantlement of that apartheid state has to be on the cards now. I don't think there's any question that people are, okay, we know the Israelis' intention is to drive them all out of Gaza now, but I don't think that's going to happen. They can't get them all out, and I don't think the world community can allow it to go back to being the open air prison it was. So we have to get to a space where, I suppose, one state with equal rights for all is on the cards, because I think a two-state solution is just a fudge to allow the aggression to continue. You know.
Comrades, it was a pleasure to have you here in our headquarters. It was an excellent experience to talk to you about all of these issues that have been plaguing our domestic and international politics, of course, and later on we will have you as guests and speakers at the party plenum. We have a saying with which I will end this podcast of ours. Within the partisan movement in World War II, there was a popular saying, "Death to fascism, freedom to the people." And every time we we send political messages. We usually use this message, death to fascism, freedom to the people, because for us, all of these new variants of fascism have been hidden behind the new forms and the new forms, but really we are facing the same enemy all over again. And of course, it is paramount to defeat such an enemy to have and to have freedom for the people. So again, thank you for having for arriving here in Macedonia to be our guests, and of course, I hope that you will have a pleasant time here.
Well, the honour is all ours. We have a saying as well that and I think you're totally right about the re-emergence of fascism, but we have one as well which says, if we fight, we might win. If we don't fight, we've lost already. And that's a message that everybody should take home and bear, because the thoughts and opinions that ordinary people in Macedonia have and are questioning the system are pretty much the same as everywhere else.
Yeah, and I just think the one word I'd finish on is solidarity. We need solidarity among all the peoples of Europe and the world, and together we can make the world a better place. And it can be very difficult at times, but I always remember the words of Noam Chomsky. About 25 years ago, he was giving a talk in New York, and this girl stood up in the crowd at a question and answer session at the end, and she says, "I don't understand," she says. "How can you keep going?" She says, "There's so much power and money against what you're talking about and what you're trying to change. And US power and money are so powerful. How can you keep going? How do you think you can change the world?" And Chomsky said, "Every human being in the world," he said, "can help to make the world a better place each day. And sometimes," he says, "it only takes a smile."
Exactly. Ви благодарам, другарки и другари, драги гледачи. Ова беа европарламентарците Клер Дејли и Мик Волас, пријатели на Левица, пријатели на слободата во Европа, во конечна пресметка со фашизмот и еден подобар, солидарен, братски свет за сите народи. Ви благодарам.